That morning, I checked my bank account, and it was completely empty. Then my son called me. "Dad, my wedding is tomorrow," he said. "I withdrew all the money from your account, and I sold the house. Good luck." I said absolutely nothing. I made a single phone call, and when the wedding day arrived, my son learned the most expensive lesson of his life. If you are watching this, do me a small favor. Subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are listening from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let me tell you exactly how this nightmare began and exactly how it ended. One honest note before we begin. This story is a work of fiction. The voice you are hearing and the images you are seeing are AI-assisted. Names, places, and events are invented for storytelling. Any resemblance to real people is purely coincidental. But the lessons about family, greed, and quiet strength are very real. Now, let us begin. It was a Friday morning in Scottsdale, Arizona. The kind of dry, golden desert morning that makes you want to sit on the porch with a cup of black coffee and watch the light climb over the mountains. My name is Raymond Holloway. I am 72 years old. I spent 31 years as a forensic auditor, chasing down financial fraud for one of the largest insurance firms in the country. I was sitting at my kitchen island, tapping the screen of my tablet to pay the monthly bills. The house was peaceful. It had been far too quiet since my wife Margaret passed away last spring. I opened my banking application. My eyes adjusted to the bright screen. And the number staring back at me was not the $512,000 I had secured just 1 week earlier. The balance read 0. For a man who spent 3 decades tracing stolen money through shell companies and offshore accounts, you would think an emptied bank account would stop my heart. You would think I would drop the tablet and gasp for air. But panic is the enemy of a clear mind. I did not gasp. I did not throw the tablet across the room. I simply sat there, and I stared into that empty digital void. That $512,000 was not my retirement. It was the life insurance payout from my late wife, Margaret, and every single penny of it was already promised to something. It was her legacy. And now it was gone. Evaporated into thin air. Before I could even process the mechanics of it, a loud, heavy thud echoed from the front hallway. I set my tablet down on the counter and walked toward the foyer. My front door was standing wide open. 2 men in thick work boots and dirty denim jackets were wrestling my antique walnut sideboard out onto the porch. It was the very same sideboard that Margaret and I bought on our honeymoon in Santa Fe 41 years ago. I raised my hand and stepped forward. "Excuse me," I said. My voice was calm, but it carried the weight of authority I used to save for cornered executives. "What exactly do you think you are doing with my furniture?" The taller man paused and wiped the sweat from his forehead. He looked at me with a mixture of annoyance and pity. "Just doing our job, buddy," he said. "The new owner wants the place cleared out by noon." The new owner. I repeated the words slowly, letting them settle in the quiet air. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my house keys. I walked to the front door and tried to slide the key into the deadbolt. It would not go in. The lock had been drilled out and replaced while I sat in my own kitchen. "I need to see your work order," I said. The younger mover handed me a crumpled paper from his clipboard. It was an expedited estate clearance order, and on the authorization line, at the very bottom, was a signature I would know anywhere in the world. The loopy, hurried handwriting of my 34-year-old son, Trevor. My own flesh and blood. The boy I taught to ride a bicycle in that driveway. The boy I bailed out of 2 separate mountains of debt. He had hired a crew of strangers to strip his own father's home down to the walls. The movers watched me closely. They expected the usual reaction of an old man losing his grip. They expected tears. They expected shouting. They expected me to call the police and make a scene right there on the lawn. But panic is a luxury you cannot afford when you are being robbed. In my career, I dismantled thieves who hid millions across a dozen countries. I know exactly how criminals operate. I know their arrogance. I know their blind spots. And I know the first rule of catching a thief. You let him believe he has already won. You let him get comfortable. You let him celebrate. "All right," I said smoothly, handing the paper back. "Just be careful with the legs on that sideboard. The wood is very old, and it is very fragile." The movers glanced at each other, completely confused by my calm, but they shrugged and carried it out to the idling truck. I walked back into my kitchen, and the house was already echoing. It felt hollow and cold. Trevor was getting married the next day, a $250,000 wedding to a woman named Vanessa. Vanessa was a self-described influencer who looked at me the way you look at a stain on an expensive rug. For months, Trevor had been drowning, maxing out every card he owned to keep up with her lifestyle. I had refused to pay for the wedding because I knew exactly what Vanessa was. I told my son he needed to learn to stand on his own 2 feet. Apparently, this was his version of standing. I did not feel sorrow. I felt a cold, calculating clarity wash over me. Every emotion shut down, and the forensic auditor inside me woke up. I walked out the back door and stood in the garden Margaret had planted with her own hands. I pulled out my phone. I did not call the police. The police would see a domestic dispute, a confused old man, and a son claiming a misunderstanding. This situation required a far more precise weapon. I dialed the number of my attorney, Julian Brandt. "Julian," I said the moment he picked up, "execute Plan B. The boy took the bait." Julian did not ask a single question. He knew exactly what Plan B meant. We had built it together, quietly, over the last 8 months. "Consider it done," he said, and the line went dead. But a good investigator knows that suspicion is never enough. I needed a confession. I needed the arrogance of the thief captured in real time in his own voice. I opened an encrypted application, pressed the record button, and dialed my son's number. The phone rang 3 times. With each ring, I looked at the bare rectangle on the floor where the sideboard used to stand. The line clicked open, and a blast of thumping music assaulted my ear. It was the unmistakable sound of an expensive day party. Clinking glasses, the loud, easy laughter of people who have never worked a hard day in their lives. "Hello?" Trevor slurred, shouting over the noise. He sounded annoyed that the call had interrupted his celebration. "Trevor," I said, my voice completely flat. "There are movers in my house taking my furniture, and my bank account has been drained to 0. Where are you?" There was a pause. I heard him mutter to someone, "Hold my drink, babe." That was Vanessa. I could hear her shrill voice asking who was bothering them. "It is just my dad," he told her. The music faded, as if he had stepped into another room. "Dad, listen to me carefully," he said. The slurring was gone now, replaced by a cold, rehearsed, condescending tone. "My wedding is tomorrow. This is the most important weekend of my life. Yes, I withdrew the money, and I sold the house." "You sold my house," I said, enunciating every word for the recording, "and you stole $500,000 of your mother's money." "It is not stealing, Dad," he sighed, as if explaining basic math to a toddler. "You are old. After that stroke last year, you have been slipping. We both know it. You do not need a big house all to yourself, and you certainly do not need hundreds of thousands of dollars sitting in an account doing nothing. Vanessa and I are building our future." Your future, I repeated. You are stealing the money set aside for your mother's memory to pay for a party. Oh, please, he scoffed, a cruel, harsh sound. Mom is gone. A building with her name on it will not bring her back. You were going to throw that money away on charity kids anyway. Consider this an early inheritance. I saved you the trouble of managing an estate. I stood in that garden, the desert sun on my shoulders, feeling ice run through my veins. The betrayal was so complete that it moved past anger and became a simple equation. He was no longer my son. He was a hostile entity. "And where am I supposed to live, Trevor?" I asked, playing the helpless old man to perfection. "That is not my problem anymore, Dad. Find a nursing home. Whatever the movers sell should cover your first few months. You will be safer with professionals watching you anyway. Good luck." The line went dead. Good luck. Those were his final words to the man who worked 80-hour weeks to put him through school, who loved his mother more than his own life. I looked down at the screen. The file was saved. 1 minute and 51 seconds of pure, recorded fraud and elder abuse. Any normal father would have stopped the movers and called the police to get his house back that instant. But if I moved now, I would only catch Trevor on a minor family dispute. Vanessa would hire a slick lawyer. They would claim a misunderstanding about estate planning, and they would tie me up in civil court for years while they spent Margaret's money down to the last dollar. I could not let them win easily today. So I turned my back on the movers, walked down the driveway, and got into my car. It was an unassuming gray sedan under the shade of a mesquite tree. I slid inside and shut the door, and the heavy thud blocked out the sound of my home being dismantled. I reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a matte black laptop. Trevor always made fun of me for carrying that old machine around. He thought I was just a gray-haired man clinging to outdated technology. He bragged constantly about his newest phone, assuming that because my hair had turned white, I could barely send an email. He never understood one thing. The very banking systems he used to move that money were built on security protocols I helped design back in the late 1990s. I was not a fumbling old man. I was the architect of the walls he thought he had breached. I powered on the machine, booted into a secure, encrypted environment, and routed my connection through 3 separate private networks. If I was going to hunt down $500,000, I was not going to leave a single footprint behind. Then I opened the raw transaction logs, and the screen filled with green code against black. There it was, an outgoing wire transfer, executed at 8:14 the previous morning. The exact amount was $512,000. I highlighted the receiving routing number. It was not a local transfer. Trevor had not simply moved the money down the street into his own checking account. He had bounced it through a third-party clearinghouse before landing it in a newly opened account at a regional bank in Phoenix. But my account, the one holding Margaret's insurance payout, was based out of Delaware. I leaned back in my seat and let out a slow breath. My son was not just a thief. He was remarkably ignorant of federal banking law. By moving that much stolen money across state lines, he had instantly turned a family dispute into a federal crime. He had committed wire fraud. And the FBI does not treat wire fraud as a disagreement over an inheritance. I began compiling the digital footprint. I downloaded the authorization forms, the timestamp logs, and the originating addresses of every keystroke. With every click, I was forging another nail for my son's coffin. Then I found how he had bypassed the bank's fraud alerts. He had uploaded a document to authorize the transfer. I pulled up the attachment and zoomed in on the pixelated scan. It was a medical and financial power of attorney. My stomach tightened because I recognized it immediately, and something was very wrong. Trevor was using the temporary power of attorney I had signed last year when I suffered a minor stroke. But that document had an expiration date. I had legally revoked it the very morning I was discharged from the hospital. I looked closer at the date on the scan. It had been crudely altered. The year had been changed by hand. My son had forged my legal documents to convince the bank he had the authority to empty my accounts. This was no longer just theft, and it was no longer just wire fraud. This was aggravated identity theft and document forgery. He had built a house of cards on a foundation of federal felonies, and he had no idea. I saved every file into an encrypted folder, backed it up to a secure server, and sent a second copy directly to Julian. The evidence was now indestructible. My mind drifted back to that terrible week last year. I had collapsed in my kitchen. I woke up 2 days later in a sterile hospital room, the left side of my body numb, terrified I would never walk again. The nurse asked if there was family she could call. I gave her Trevor's number. She called him 3 times. He never answered. He never answered because he and Vanessa were on a beach in Cabo drinking margaritas. I know this because the nurses took pity on me and helped me open my phone, and I saw his posts. I saw the pictures of them laughing in the sun while I lay in the shadows, fighting for my life. I recovered alone. I pushed through months of grueling physical therapy alone. I regained my strength, my speech, and my mind completely alone. And now, he was standing at a rehearsal dinner in a tuxedo I had unknowingly paid for, using the very illness he ignored as the weapon to declare me incompetent. I closed the laptop. I did not feel the crushing weight of loss anymore. I felt the cold, sharp edge of absolute resolve. It was time to pay my respects to the happy couple. I parked the sedan in a public garage and took a black car the rest of the way because I did not want my familiar sedan giving them advance warning. The ride into the hills above the city took 40 minutes. We pulled up to a massive iron gate and a sprawling glass and stone mansion that Trevor and Vanessa had rented for the entire weekend. It was the exaggerated luxury that people with no real wealth love to display. Since guests were still arriving, the security guard simply waved us through. I stepped out, straightened my plain khaki jacket, and walked up the wide stone steps toward the open double doors. Live jazz drifted out into the evening air. Inside, the foyer was blindingly white. White marble, white leather, and modern art the size of doors. Caterers moved silently through a crowd of tailored suits and designer gowns, carrying trays of champagne bought entirely with my dead wife's money. It did not take long to find Vanessa. She was holding court near an indoor waterfall, wearing a pearl-colored silk dress that cost more than my first car. She threw her head back to laugh at a joke, making sure the hired photographer caught her best angle. Then her eyes swept the room and locked onto me. The fake smile vanished from her face as if she had been struck. She blinked twice, unable to understand how the pathetic old man they had just evicted was standing in the middle of her perfect party. She handed her glass to a passing waiter and marched toward me, her heels clicking sharply against the marble like a metronome counting down to an explosion. I let my shoulders slump. I softened my face. I needed her to see weakness. I needed her to feel powerful, so she would grow careless and make mistakes. She stopped inches from my face and turned her body to block me from the room. Her perfume was suffocating. "What on earth are you doing here?" she hissed, her whisper laced with venom. "You were not invited, Raymond." I let my voice tremble. "I just needed to speak with my son. There were men at my house, taking my things." Her manicured nails dug into my wrist hard enough to leave marks. "Keep your voice down, you crazy old fool," she ordered, her eyes wild with panic. "Look at you. You look like you wandered in off the street. There are investors and sponsors in that room, My brand depends on this weekend looking flawless." A slow, ugly smile spread across her lips as she leaned in, savoring it. "That is exactly why Trevor took over your finances. You cannot even dress yourself. We are doing you a favor, old man." Then she reached into her clutch, pulled out a crisp $100 bill, and shoved it flat against my chest, pinning it there with 2 fingers. "You have 0 power here," she whispered, and I could hear the pleasure in every word. "You are broke, you are homeless, and you are a stain on my perfect weekend. Take this, call yourself a cab, and disappear before I have security drag you out onto the street." I took the bill without a word and slipped it into my trouser pocket. I did not argue. I simply looked at her, lowered my head, and let her believe she had won. Because I have interviewed hundreds of people who thought they were untouchable, and I have learned that the ones who gloat are the ones who hang themselves. Before she could call the guards, a heavy hand landed on my shoulder. It was Trevor. He reeked of expensive cologne and darker scotch. "Vanessa is right, Dad. You should not be here," he said, his voice tight. "But since you are, we will settle this away from my guests." He gripped my shoulder and steered me down a long hallway into a private, oak-paneled study, then shut the heavy door, cutting off the music. He leaned against a massive desk and crossed his arms, looking at me not with the love of a son, but with the cold irritation of a man managing a nuisance. I stood near the door, let my hands shake, and kept my head down. "What is this, Trevor?" I asked, my voice cracking perfectly. "Why are strangers taking your mother's furniture?" He sighed and rubbed his temples as if I were a headache. "Dad, we talked about this. Do you really not remember?" It was a smooth, practiced lie. He reached into his jacket and tossed a folded legal document onto the desk. "I had to step in," he said, his tone sliding into mock sympathy. "Ever since your stroke, your decline has been obvious to everyone. Leaving you alone in that big house with that much money was irresponsible. I am your son. It is my job to protect you." I stepped forward and let my hands tremble violently as I picked it up. It was the forged power of attorney, the same one I had seen on my laptop, now heavy and real in my hands. He was using my illness as his ultimate weapon. "It is all completely legal, Dad," he said, watching me stare at the page. And in that moment, I understood that this was bigger than my son alone. A wedding like this did not run on stolen inheritance money that had not even cleared yet. Someone else was funding the front end. Someone was owed. Over the next hour, playing the broken and defeated old father, I gathered the last pieces. I let Trevor and Vanessa believe I had accepted my fate. And greedy people cannot resist explaining their own cleverness to a man they think is harmless. I learned about Dominic, Vanessa's so-called business partner, the man quietly bankrolling her brand and this entire spectacle. Dominic had borrowed $750,000 from a private lending outfit that did not operate by any law you would find in a courthouse. He had fronted the cash for the venue, the venture, and the lifestyle on one simple promise: that my money would flow into the marriage and pay everyone back the day after the wedding. They had built their entire pyramid on a single assumption: that the $512,000 I had traced across state lines was theirs to spend. I let them keep believing it. Then I called a cab, exactly as instructed, and I went to a quiet hotel to make my final calls. That night, I did not sleep. I sat at a small desk with Julian on speakerphone, and we assembled the case like a clean set of books. The recorded confession, the altered power of attorney, the interstate wire transfer, the revoked authorization I had filed months earlier. Julian had already made contact with a special agent named Ruiz in the Financial Crimes Division, a woman who had spent her career on exactly this kind of fraud. By 2 a.m, everything was in her hands. The evidence was airtight, the jurisdiction was federal, and the timeline was perfect. They did not want to move in the empty hours of the night. They wanted the transfer of stolen funds documented at the moment it was meant to complete. And Trevor had told the whole world, in gold lettering on 200 embossed invitations, the exact time and place he would be standing still. 11 o'clock the next morning. At the altar. The wedding was held in the garden of that same rented mansion, under a white canopy dripping with imported flowers. I did not hide. I sat quietly in the very last row, in the same plain khaki jacket, an uninvited old man that no one bothered to remove because no one believed he mattered. Vanessa walked down the aisle in a gown that cost more than most people earn in a year. Trevor waited at the altar, beaming, certain he had won. Dominic stood near the back, checking his phone every 30 seconds, waiting for a notification that the funds had cleared. And at 3 minutes past 11, that notification never came. Instead, 4 black sedans rolled quietly through the iron gate. Special Agent Ruiz walked across that manicured lawn in a dark suit, flanked by 6 federal agents, straight down the flower-strewn aisle, and she did not stop until she reached the altar.
"Trevor Holloway,"
she said, her voice carrying clearly over the string quartet that had stumbled into silence. "You are under arrest for wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and forgery of a federal financial instrument." The champagne flutes froze in 200 hands. Vanessa screamed that there had been a mistake, that her fiancé was a successful man, that these people had no idea who they were dealing with. An agent read her rights as well, for criminal conspiracy. And, near the back, Dominic understood before anyone else what the frozen account truly meant. His $750,000 was now sealed inside a federal evidence hold, untouchable, gone. The men he had borrowed it from did not care about court orders or evidence holds. They only cared that their money had vanished. I watched the color drain from his face as he slipped out a side gate and disappeared, already a hunted man. Trevor turned toward me across that ruined garden, his hands cuffed behind his back, his tuxedo suddenly looking like a costume. For the first time in years, he truly saw me. Not a confused old man, not a slipping invalid, but a forensic auditor who had spent 31 years learning exactly how men like his own son destroy themselves. "Dad," he choked out, "please." I said nothing to him. There was nothing left to say. Instead, I walked over to where Vanessa sat collapsed on a white chair, her perfect aesthetic dissolving into mascara and panic. I reached into my trouser pocket and pulled out the crisp $100 bill she had shoved against my chest the night before. I held it between 2 fingers, exactly as she had, and I let it fall. It drifted down and landed softly in her lap. "You should take a taxi, Vanessa," I said, my voice cold and even. "Your perfect aesthetic is completely ruined." 6 months have passed since that morning. The autumn air has settled over Scottsdale, and with it, a quiet peace I had not felt in a very long time. I am sitting on the front porch of my home, the same home that was stripped bare by careless movers, now completely restored. Every piece of furniture, every painting, every memory has been returned to its rightful place. The walnut sideboard sits exactly where Margaret and I set it down 41 years ago, its wood gleaming in the morning light, reminding me that some foundations simply cannot be broken. The justice system moved quickly once the evidence was laid out. Faced with the recordings, the forged documents, and the interstate wire fraud, Trevor did not even fight. On his lawyer's advice, he took a plea. My son is now serving 5 years in a federal facility. He writes me letters. I read every one. I do not reply. His letters are full of apology, but they read like the regrets of a man who is sorry he was caught, not sorry for what he did. Perhaps in 5 years he will finally understand the value of an honest dollar. Vanessa did not fare much better. She tried to sell a tearful story of victimhood, but the prosecutors did not believe a word of it. She is under investigation for conspiracy. Her sponsors have all vanished, and the wealthy friends she worked so hard to impress abandoned her the instant the handcuffs appeared. She now lives in a small apartment, working a minimum-wage job to pay her mounting legal fees. And Dominic was never seen again. The men who lent him that money do not forgive frozen accounts. Wherever he is tonight, he is looking over his shoulder, jumping at every shadow, having traded a comfortable life for a permanent waking nightmare. He bought that with his own greed. A sleek black car pulls into my driveway, and Julian steps out carrying a leather briefcase. He walks up the steps and hands me a crisp stack of documents with a warm, genuine smile. Today's the day, my friend. The federal court not only restored the stolen $512,000, it released the seized funds as restitution for the damage done to my estate. I take the silver pen he offers, and with a few deliberate strokes, I sign the final charter. The defunct schoolhouse on the east side of town has been purchased and fully renovated. Next week, we cut the ribbon on the Margaret Holloway Reading House, a free library and learning center for children who have no one and nowhere. My Margaret taught school children for 40 years, and this was the promise I made her in the hospice, holding her frail hand. A legacy of kindness, built from the ashes of greed. They thought my silence was weakness. They forgot that a silent auditor is never idle. He is simply adding up the true cost of your ruin, line by line, until the numbers are ready to be read aloud. This is a work of fiction, and the voice you have been listening to is not a living man. But the lesson underneath it is as real as the ground beneath your feet. Family is not blood. It is respect. They wanted my inheritance. In the end, the only thing they inherited was the ruin they earned with their own hands. My name is Raymond Holloway, and what I built with the woman I loved, I made sure went exactly where it belonged.